Have you ever wondered why, in the richest society in human history, we have an epidemic of depression, anxiety, and burnout, yet the dominant narrative tells you that your mental health struggles are fundamentally your personal failing? Have you ever questioned why, despite having access to more self-help resources, therapy apps, and wellness products than any generation before us, rates of depression continue to skyrocket? What if I told you that you've been systematically conditioned to believe that your depression is your responsibility precisely because it serves an economic system that profits your suffering while absolving itself of any accountability for the condition that created that suffering in the first place? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the logical outcome of a specific economic philosophy that has shaped every aspect of modern life for the past 50 years. The philosophy of Milton, Friedman, and the Chicago School of Economics didn't just change how we think about markets, government, and business. It fundamentally altered how we understand human suffering, personal responsibility, and the relationship between individual pain and systemic dysfunction. What Friedman and his followers created was an intellectual framework that makes it almost impossible to see how economic policies directly cause psychological harm, while simultaneously making it seem natural, even inevitable, that you should take full responsibility for the mental health consequences of living in a system designed to extract maximum value from your labor, your time, your attention, and your very sense of self. The statistics are staggering. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, major depressive disorder affects approximately 21 million adults each year. That's nearly 1 in 10 people. Anxiety disorders affect over 40 million adults. Suicide rates have increased by 35% since 1999. Burnout syndrome is now recognized by the World Health Organization as an occupational phenomenon. These aren't just numbers. These represent millions of people who have been told, explicitly or implicitly, that their suffering is a personal problem requiring individual solution, while the systemic factors that create the conditions for mass psychological stress remain invisible, unexamined, and unchanged. But here's what the data actually reveals when you look at it through a systemic lens rather than an individual. Countries with stronger social safety nets, more regulated working conditions, and greater economic equality consistently show lower rates of depression and anxiety. Societies that prioritize collective well-being over individual competition have significantly better population-level mental health outcomes. The correlation isn't coincidental, it's causal. The economic system that prioritizes profit over people, competition over cooperation, and individual responsibility over collective care creates the very conditions that produce mass psychological suffering. This understanding has been systematically obscured by what we might call the Friedman doctrine of psychological responsibility, just as Friedman argued that the free market was the ultimate expression of human freedom while ignoring how market forces constrain and control human behavior. The psychological establishment has been trained to see mental health problems as individual pathologies while remaining blind to the economic pathologies that create them. The result is a system where you are told to optimize yourself to fit a sick society, rather than questioning why the society is making so many people sick. I am going to reveal to you 8 specific mechanisms through which you've been convinced that your depression is your responsibility, when in fact it's the predictable outcome of living in an economic system that treats human well-being as an externality to be ignored rather than a fundamental measure of success. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand not just how this psychological manipulation works, but why it's essential to the functioning of our current economic system. More importantly, you will have the tools to resist this manipulation and reclaim your right to understand your suffering in its proper context. The first mechanism is what I call the privatization of suffering. Milton Friedman's core argument was that private markets were inherently more efficient than public institutions at allocating resources and solving problems. This logic was systematically applied to mental health, transforming psychological distress from a social requiring collective solutions into a private problem requiring individual consumer choices. When you are depressed, you are not encouraged to examine whether your working condition, your economic insecurity, or your social isolation might be contributing factors that could be addressed through policy changes. Instead, you are directed toward private solutions, therapy, medication, self-help books, wellness apps, lifestyle changes. All of these place the burden of solution squarely on your shoulders and your wallet. This privatization serves a dual function. First, it creates enormous profit opportunities in what's now called the wellness industry, estimated to be worth over $4.5 trillion globally. Second, and more importantly, It prevents the formation of collective understanding about shared experiences of suffering. When everyone believes their depression is a private individual problem, no one organizes to change the condition that create depression for millions of people simultaneously. The privatization of suffering is not just about making money from your pain. It's about preventing you from recognizing that your pain is shared, systemic, and therefore changeable through collective action. Consider how this privatization manifests in your daily life. When you're struggling with depression, what's the first thing people tell you? Have you tried therapy? Are you taking medication? Have you considered meditation? Maybe you need to exercise more. These aren't malicious suggestions, but notice how they all assume the problem and the solution reside entirely within you. No one asks, are you working too many hours for too little pay? Are you isolated because our communities have been destroyed by economic policy that prioritize mobility over stability? Are you anxious because you have no economic security in a system that can eliminate your job at any moment? The privatization of suffering makes these systemic questions literally unthinkable. The second mechanism is the pathologization of normal responses to abnormal conditions. Friedman's economic philosophy was based on the assumption that markets naturally create optimal outcomes, which means that any problems people experience must be due to their personal failures to adapt to market conditions rather than problems with the market itself. This same logic has been applied to mental health. If the economic system is assumed to be natural and optimal, then psychological distress must be a personal pathology rather than a normal response to harmful conditions. But here's what the evidence actually shows. Depression, anxiety, and other forms of psychological distress are normal, predictable responses to conditions of economic insecurity, social fragmentation, and chronic stress. A comprehensive study published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health found that job insecurity alone increases the risk of depression by 30%. Research in social science and medicine demonstrates that income inequality within communities directly correlates with rates of mental illness, independent of absolute income level. Studies in the American Journal of Public Health show that workers in insecure employment conditions have significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression than those with stable employment. What this research demonstrates is that your depression might not be a pathology at all. It might be your psyche's appropriate response to living in conditions that are genuinely harmful to human well-being. When you're told that your depression is a chemical imbalance or a cognitive distortion, you're being told to ignore the possibility that your depression is actually your mind's way of telling you that something is seriously wrong with your environment, not with. This pathologization serves the system by preventing you from trusting your own psychological responses to harmful conditions. If you're depressed because you're working in a job that's meaningless, exhausting, and poorly paid, your depression might be accurate information about your situation. But if you're convinced that your depression is a personal pathology, you'll focus on changing your brain chemistry rather than changing your working condition. You'll adapt yourself to fit the system rather than questioning whether the system should be adapted to fit human needs. The third mechanism is what I call the responsibilization of systemic failure. Friedman argued that individuals were responsible for their economic outcomes because free markets rewarded personal effort and good choices. This logic has been extended to mental health, where you're told that your psychological state is the result of your personal choices, habits, and effort. This isn't just victim blaming. It's a sophisticated form of social control that prevents you from recognizing how economic policies directly impact your mental health. The concept of responsibilization comes from critical sociology and describes how neoliberal policies transfer responsibility for social problems from institutions to individuals. In the context of mental health, this means that the psychological consequences of economic insecurity, social isolation, and chronic stress are reframed as personal responsibilities that you must manage through individual effort and consumer choices. Here's how this works in practice. When unemployment rises due to economic policies that prioritize corporate profits over job security, the resulting increase in depression and anxiety rates is not attributed to those policies. Instead, unemployed people are told that they need to develop resilience, improve their employability, and maintain a positive attitude during their job search. The systemic creation of unemployment becomes invisible, while the psychological consequences of unemployment become personal failings that require individual solutions. Research published in Social Psychiatry and Psychiatric Epidemiology shows that unemployment rates are directly correlated with suicide rates, with effects that are consistent across different countries and time periods. A study in The Lancet found that the 2008 financial crisis led to over 10,000 additional suicides in the United States and Europe. These aren't coincidences. They're the predictable psychological consequences of economic policies that treat human employment as disposable. But instead of connecting these dots, the mental health establishment has been trained to see the psychological consequences of economic instability as individual pathologies requiring individual treatment. This responsibilization serves the economic system by ensuring that the human costs of economic policies remain invisible and unaccounted for. If you're depressed because you've lost your job due to policies that prioritize shareholder profits over worker security, you're encouraged to see your depression as your personal responsibility, rather than as evidence that the system is working exactly. The fourth mechanism is the commodification of mental health solutions. Friedman believed that market mechanisms were the most efficient way to deliver services, including healthcare. This philosophy has transformed mental health from a social good into a commodity, creating a system where your access to psychological well-being depends on your ability to pay for it. This commodification doesn't just limit access to care. It fundamentally changes how mental health problems are understood and addressed. When mental health becomes a commodity, the focus shifts from preventing psychological distress to treating it after it occurs. This is enormously profitable for the mental health industry, but it completely ignores the social and economic factors that create psychological distress in the first place. A study in Health Affairs found that the United States spends more on mental health treatment than any other country, yet has among the highest rates of depression and anxiety in the developed world. This isn't a coincidence. It's the predictable result of a system that profits from treating the symptoms of psychological distress while ignoring the causes. The commodification of mental health also creates what economists call moral hazard, where the system that profits from your suffering has no incentive to prevent that suffering. Pharmaceutical companies make billions from antidepressant. Therapy practices expand their client base. Wellness apps increase their user engagement. The mental health industry has a vested interest in maintaining the conditions that create demand for their services, even if those conditions are harmful to your well-being. But here's the more insidious aspect of commodification. When mental health solutions are commodified, they're marketed to you as products that will fix your individual problem. You're told that the right therapy, the right medication, the right APP, or the right lifestyle change will solve your depression. This marketing reinforces the idea that your depression is your individual problem requiring individual solutions, while the systemic factors that contribute to depression remain unaddressed and unchanged. Research in the Journal of Health Economics shows that countries with more commodified healthcare systems have worse population-level mental health outcomes than countries with more socialized systems. A comparative study in health policy found that people in countries with universal healthcare systems report significantly lower levels of anxiety and depression related to health concerns. The commodification of mental health doesn't just limit access to care. It actively worsens the psychological conditions it claims to address. The fifth mechanism is what I call the optimization imperative. Friedman's theory of human capital treated people as economic resources that could be optimized for maximum productivity. This logic has been applied to mental health, where you're told that managing your depression is a form of self-optimization that will make you more productive, successful, and valuable. This isn't just about treating mental illness. It's about transforming your entire relationship with your psychological experience into a project of economic optimization. The optimization imperative manifests in the constant pressure to hack your mental health through productivity techniques, biohacking, quantified self-monitoring, and lifestyle optimization. You're encouraged to see your depression not as a response to harmful conditions, but as a performance problem be solved through better personal management. This transforms your mental health from a human right into a competitive advantage, creating additional pressure and anxiety around your psychological well-being. But here's what the research actually shows about the optimization imperative. Studies in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology demonstrate that workplace wellness programs focused on individual optimization actually increase stress and anxiety for many participants. Research in applied psychology shows that self-monitoring and optimization techniques can worsen depression and anxiety for people who are already struggling with these conditions. The optimization imperative doesn't just fail to address the root causes of psychological distress. It often makes the distress worse by adding additional layers of self-surveillance and self-blame. The optimization imperative also creates what psychologists call the paradox of choice, where having too many options for managing your mental health creates additional anxiety about making the right choices. When you're told that your depression is your responsibility and that there are hundreds of different ways to optimize your mental health, you're faced with an impossible burden of choice that can worsen the very conditions you're trying to address. Research published in Psychological Science shows that people who engage in high levels of self-optimization often experience increased levels of anxiety, depression, and self-criticism. A study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who view their personal characteristics as malleable and optimizable report higher levels of stress and lower levels of life satisfaction than people who view themselves as fundamentally acceptable as they are. The sixth mechanism is the individualization of collective suffering. Friedman's methodological individualism insisted that social phenomena could be explained entirely through individual choices and behaviors. This approach has been applied to mental health, where collective experiences of psychological distress are broken down into individual cases, preventing people from recognizing shared experiences and collective causes. When millions of people experience depression simultaneously, this could be understood as evidence of systemic problems that require collective solutions. But the individualization of collective suffering prevents this recognition by insisting that each case of depression is unique and personal. This individualization serves the economic system by preventing the formation of collective consciousness about shared experiences of suffering. Consider the evidence for collective suffering. Research in the American Journal of Sociology shows that depression rates correlate with community-level factors like economic inequality, social cohesion, and access to public services. Studies in social science and medicine demonstrate that mental health outcomes are influenced by neighborhood characteristics, social capital, and community resources. The Journal of Health and Social Behavior publishes research showing that psychological distress follows predictable patterns related to social class, employment condition, and economic policies. This research demonstrates that your depression is not just your individual experience. It's part of a broader pattern of collective suffering that results from systemic conditions. But the individualization of collective suffering prevents you from seeing these patterns and connecting with others who share similar experiences. The individualization of collective suffering also prevents political action. When you believe that your depression is your unique, individual problem, you're unlikely to organize with others to address the systemic conditions that create depression for millions of people. The individualization of suffering is not just a clinical approach. It's a form of political control that prevents collective action for systemic change. The seventh mechanism is the normalization of toxic conditions. Friedman argued that free markets naturally created optimal conditions for human flourishing, which meant that any problems people experienced were due to their failure to adapt to market conditions rather than problems with the conditions themselves. This logic has been applied to mental health, where you're told to adapt yourself to harmful conditions rather than recognizing that the conditions themselves might be the problem. The normalization of toxic conditions manifests in the expectation that you should be able to maintain good mental health regardless of your circumstances. If you're working 60 hours a week for poverty wages, you are told to develop work-life balance rather than questioning whether 60-hour work weeks are sustainable. If you're isolated and lonely, you're told to work on your social skills rather than examining how economic policies have destroyed community and social connection. Research in occupational medicine shows that workers in high-stress, low-control jobs significantly higher rates of depression and anxiety than workers in low-stress, high-control jobs. Studies in the Journal of Community Psychology demonstrate that people living in communities with strong social networks and public services have better mental health outcomes than people in fragmented, privatized communities. The evidence shows that environmental conditions directly impact mental health outcomes. But instead of addressing these toxic conditions, the mental health establishment has focused on helping people adapt. This adaptation serves the economic system by ensuring that harmful working conditions, social isolation, and economic insecurity can continue without resistance. If you can be trained to see your depression as your personal failing, rather than as evidence that your conditions are harmful, then those conditions never need to change. The normalization of toxic conditions also creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, where people stop trying to change harmful conditions because they've been taught that the conditions are normal and unchangeable. This learned helplessness serves the economic system by preventing people from organizing to improve their working, demand better social services, or challenge policies that prioritize profits over human well-being. The eighth and final mechanism is what I call the therapeutic nullification of political consciousness. Friedman's philosophy was inherently anti-political, arguing that market mechanisms should replace democratic decision-making in most areas of life. This anti-political stance has been extended to mental health, where political consciousness about the systemic causes of suffering is pathologized as unhealthy, while acceptance of harmful conditions is promoted as psychological maturity. Therapeutic nullification works by reframing legitimate anger about injustice as a psychological problem that needs to be managed rather than a political response that needs to be organized. If you're angry about working conditions that are harming your mental health, you're told to work on anger management rather than organizing to improve those conditions. If you're anxious about economic insecurity, you're told to practice acceptance rather than advocating for policies that would provide economic security. This nullification serves the economic system by preventing the formation of political movement that could challenge the conditions that create mass psychological suffering. Research in political psychology shows that collective action can actually improve mental health outcomes by giving people a sense of agency and collective efficacy. Studies in the Journal of Community and Applied Social Psychology demonstrate that people who engage in political action report higher levels of psychological well-being than people who remain politically passive. But the therapeutic establishment has been trained to see political consciousness as potentially harmful to mental health. This creates a system where the very activities that could improve collective well-being are discouraged as psychologically unhealthy, while passive acceptance of harmful conditions is promoted as mental health. The therapeutic nullification of political consciousness also creates what critical psychologists call the privatization of resistance, where your natural impulses to resist harmful conditions are redirected toward private, individual activities rather than collective political action. Instead of organizing with others to improve working conditions, you're told to practice mindfulness to cope with bad working conditions. Instead of advocating for social services that could reduce economic insecurity, you're told to develop resilience to cope with insecurity. Now that you understand these 8 mechanisms, you can see how they work together to create a comprehensive system for convincing you that your depression is your responsibility. The privatization of suffering isolates you from collective understanding. The pathologization of normal responses makes you distrust your own psychological reactions to harmful conditions. The responsibilization of systemic failure makes you blame yourself for problems created by policies. The commodification of solution makes you focus on individual consumption rather than systemic change. The optimization imperative makes you see mental health as a competitive advantage rather than a human right. The individualization of collective suffering prevents you from recognizing shared experiences. The normalization of toxic conditions makes you adapt to harm rather than resisting. And the therapeutic nullification of political consciousness prevents you from organizing to change the conditions that create suffering. These mechanisms don't operate independently. They reinforce each other to create a closed system where your suffering is always your fault, your solutions are always individual, and your resistance is always pathological. This system serves the economic interests of those who profit from your suffering, while ensuring that the condition that creates suffering never face serious challenge. But understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward resisting them. When you recognize that your depression might be a normal response to abnormal condition, you can begin to trust your own psychological experience. When you understand that your suffering is shared by millions of people facing similar conditions, you can begin to see collective possibilities for change. When you recognize that your anger about injustice is politically rational rather than psychologically pathological, you can begin to channel that anger toward organized resistance. Your depression is not your fault. It's not your individual pathology. It's not your personal failing. Your depression is evidence that you're a human being with normal psychological responses to conditions that are genuinely harmful to human well-being. The system that created these conditions has spent enormous resources convincing you that your suffering is your responsibility, because that conviction prevents you from holding the system accountable for the suffering it creates. The path forward requires both individual healing and collective action. You deserve support, care, and treatment for your psychological suffering. But you also deserve to live in conditions that support human flourishing rather than extracting profit from human misery. These goals are not contradictory. They're complementary aspects of a complete approach to human well-being. The most radical thing you can do is to stop taking responsibility for suffering that was created by policies you didn't choose, working conditions you don't control, and economic systems you didn't design. Start connecting your personal experience to the experiences of others facing similar conditions. Begin to see your psychological responses as potentially accurate information about your environment rather than personal pathology requiring individual correction. Your mental health is not a private commodity to be optimized for economic productivity. It's a social good that requires collective care and systemic change. The system that convinced you that your depression is your responsibility is the same system that creates the conditions for mass depression. Recognizing this connection is not just the beginning of your healing, it's the beginning of collective resistance to a system that treats human suffering as an acceptable cost doing business. You are not broken. The system is broken. Your depression is not your failure. It's the system's failure. And recognizing this truth is the first step toward building something better.